pleasant day to you all. Welcome to the discussion of the memo for history paper 1 November exams. All right, we are going to go through the paper, and we are going to go through some discussions of the possible responses that are relevant to the given questions in this paper for our November session. Right, as usual, you understand our history paper is a paper which is comprised of 6 questions with 3 source-based questions and 3 essay questions, of which you are supposed to answer either 2 source-based questions or 2 source-based questions with 1 essay, or 2 essays and 1 source-based question, which implies that a total number of 3 questions must be answered, with each question having a total of 50 marks to make it 150 marks in a time frame of 3 hours. Right, without wasting time, we need to go through our paper. Right, as usual, our sections are always question number 1, the Cold War, the origins of Cold War, which is question number 1 for source-based question, and question number 2 is independent Africa, which is a case study for Angola. Then question number 3 is based on civil society protests from the 1950s to 1970s, which is the US civil rights movement. Then our essay questions, which is section B, we have question number 4, which is the extension of Cold War, a case study for Vietnam. And question number 5, independent Africa, which is a case study for the Congo. And lastly, we have the civil society protests from the 1950s to the 1970s. Our focus is the Black Power movement. Right, we go to our questions and we try to analyze our questions and try to relate the questions to the addendum, and also try to figure out the best possible responses. Right, our first question, we're going to look at our first question. The focus of our question is saying, how did the policy of containment contribute to Cold War tensions between the United States of America and the Soviet Union in 1947? How did the policy of containment contribute to Cold War tensions between the United States of America and the Soviet Union in 1947? Right, as you are seeing here, we are seeing a situation of the policy of containment, which was introduced by the Americans as a way of trying to stop the spread of communist ideologies across states in Europe. So that is our focus question. It ultimately caused an increase in the level of tension between the United States of America and the USSR in the year 1947. So our focus is the policy of containment here and how it contributed towards the tensions between the USA and the USSR. Right, without wasting time, we'll go to our first question. We are relating to source 1A. Right, our source 1A, we're going to refer to it after analyzing the question. The first part is saying, who, according to the source, did Churchill blame for a shadow that he has fallen upon the scene so lately, lighted by the Allied victory? We must give 2 responses for that question. Who, according, who is being referred to here by Churchill as being blamed for a shadow that has fallen upon the scene so lately, lighted by the Allied victory. But if we go to our sources, this is a level 1 question, which is an extraction question. We are just supposed to extract our response from the given source. So if we check our source, it says, a shadow is fallen upon the scene so lately by the Allied victory. And it goes on to say, nobody knows what the Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intend to do in the immediate future. So the implication is the Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization. They are the ones who are being blamed in this particular instance of our question. Who did Churchill blame for a shadow that has fallen upon the scenes? So they are blaming the Soviet Russia, and also they are blaming the Communist International Organization. So those are our responses for our first question. The 2 responses is the Soviet Russia, and we also see the Communist International Organization. Right, going to the next question. Why do you think Churchill adopted a conciliatory or a soft attitude towards the Soviet Union despite its expansive tendencies? But we are seeing a situation here whereby Winston Churchill adopted a soft attitude towards USSR. Despite it having expansive tendencies, it wanted to extend its territories across, extend its influence across territories in Europe, which was also threatening the ideology of the US. But however, the US did not take a bold stance. It took a conciliatory or a soft attitude towards the USA. What might be the possible reason towards that? The most definite reason here that we can highlight, though there are other reasons. Remember, these are Cold War tensions. We are looking at Cold War tensions here. The countries were just engaged in ideological fighting and not physical fighting. So what was going to happen in case maybe the US was adopting a policy which was strongly against the expansive tendencies of Russia? So we might argue that they wanted to avoid, or let me just use the available space so that maybe it becomes clearer. Right, why did they adopt such a stance and not adopt a bold stance? We might argue that in that instance, why they did that, we can say the USA, that's number 112, to avoid a physical confrontation. Or rather, we can say to avoid a hot war between the two extreme ends. We understand that there was tension between the USA and USSR. So in this instance, they wanted just to have an ideological war. They wanted to avoid physical confrontation, or rather avoid a physical war in this instance. That might be one of the probable reasons why they chose to adopt a soft approach towards the USSR's expansive policy and not take a bold stance to avoid them from expanding. They wanted to avoid such a physical confrontation that might lead to a hot war in that instance. Right. We are not saying that is the only response. There might be other also responses that you can highlight in the context of the question that will also qualify to be true responses. Right. Moving on to the next question. Define the term iron curtain in your own words. Right. If we check here, let's try to get the context of the term iron curtain. Right. If we check here, it says from setting in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended. An iron curtain has descended or has fallen across the continent. An iron curtain falling across the continent. In this context here, we are saying what is the iron context, or what is the iron curtain in the context of this given scenario here. We are told that the iron curtain has descended or fallen across the continent, which implies that was something that had befallen at the continent of Europe. So when we are looking at the iron curtain, right, we are looking at, in this instance, we can say it's an imaginary boundary. That separated Europe, or that divided, that separated communists from capitalists in Europe. That's the idea behind the iron curtain. We are saying the iron curtain here, it implies that there was now a boundary which was splitting Europe into two. The eastern side dominated by USSR and the western side dominated by capitalism. So we are now saying the effect of the descendants of the Iron Curtain, or the falling of the Iron Curtain, that was the implication of the coming of a boundary, which was imaginary, which was now dividing Europe into a communist side and a capitalist side. That's the implication of the Iron Curtain in this instance. Right, moving on to the next question, number 114. Right, number 114 is saying, comment on what Churchill implied by the words. All these famous cities and the population around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. Lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. Right, if we check in on the context of the question, where do we get that statement? It talks about this, behind that line lie all capitals of the ancient states, all those states that are indicated there, right? And it says all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. That is where we're getting our statement. Is highlighting those cities in Eastern and Central Europe. And it continues to say all these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. So what the implication? The implication there is, if you have to take from it there, we can say the implication of that statement, it means those cities were now under the control of communism, or we can say they were dominated by USSR. All those cities that were mentioned there, they were now under the control of communism, or they were dominated by the ideas of the USSR. Or we can also say in another context, Eastern and part of Central Europe became states of interest, states of influence of the USSR, which implies that those cities in part of Eastern Europe or part of Central Europe, they became spheres of influence. They became spheres of interest. Those states, they were influenced by the USSR, or those cities and the people there were also influenced by the ideas of the USSR. And also, in other words, it implies that the world was split into capitalists and communists. Because if you see those states that have been limited, that is, those cities that were listed, they are mainly in the Eastern to Central, but not extending to the West. So the other implication is also that Europe was divided. And the East fell under the domination by USSR. That might be the other implication of that statement. Right, moving on to the next question. We want to move to the next question. Next question is talking about number 115. Explain the reliability of this source to a historian researching about the origins of the Cold War. Reliability. Our question is focusing on the reliability of this particular source. Reliability. What must we check here? When the question is asking about reliability, is asking about whether we can we trust the source? That's the question. Can we trust the source? You must ask yourself that question if you are to check on reliability. Can we trust this source? So let's go to the source and try to figure out elements of reliability in that particular source. As usual, I encourage people to check on the context of the source so that they can figure out. This context is saying the source below is an extract from the Iron Curtain, a speech delivered by Britain's former Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, in Fulton, Missouri, in the USA, on 5 March 1946. It was taken from the Chambers Book of Great Speeches, edited by A. Barnett, it highlights how communism had spread into Eastern Europe. So if you check that context of the source there, you can actually get the ideas of reliability of that particular source. One form of reliability here, it says it's a speech delivered by, it's a speech, which means when it's a speech, it's a primary source. It's one form of reliability. We say primary sources are more reliable compared to secondary sources because primary sources are eyewitness sources. They are more likely to be reliable compared to secondary sources. So for that reason, that being a speech, it also implies that it's a primary source and it's more reliable. And who produced the source? It was produced by Britain's former Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. It's also reliable for the sake that it was produced by the British former Prime Minister who was involved or who actively participated in the Cold War tensions, in that time of Cold War tensions between capitalism and communism. So we can also safely rely for the fact that it was produced by Britain's former Prime Minister. It's more reliable. And also if we check, it was produced on 5 March 1946, the time factor. If we check out the time, we understand 5 March 1946. That was when Cold War tensions were on at their height. So we can also safely rely on that because of the factor of time. The source was produced within the time frame of the historical event and therefore is more reliable. Unlike if it was produced 20 years later, some facts might be misrepresented or some facts might be lost because of the time factor. But this source was produced during the time of the onset of and the height of the Cold War tensions. So we can safely rely on that, given that the source was produced during the time of the heated Cold War tensions. And also besides that, we can also rely, because it was taken from the Chambers Book of Great Speeches, which is a reliable book that we can also safely rely on. The source where this extract was taken from, it was taken from a renowned history book, which makes it more reliable. So if you base on those aspects, you can be guaranteed that your responses will be correct. But we are not saying those are the only pieces of reliability that we can rely on. We can also figure out other possible factors that will guarantee that source to become regarded as a reliable source. Right, taking you to the next question. Right, the next question we are looking at source 1B. Explain the symbolic representation of the following. The symbolic representation of the following. We have the bear or the wolf, which is labeled communist infiltration and dictatorship threats. And we have the US aid hammer. Right, let's go to our addendum and look at those two. We want to look at the representation of those. Right. If we come here, we are seeing there's a wolf here, or it's either a bear or a wolf, which is advancing in that direction. And it says we are driving at, and it's labeled communist infiltration and dictatorship threats. And then we have the US aid. There is a hammer, which is labeled US aid. So we are referring to these two figures. This is the first figure for A. This is the other figure for B. So the symbolic representation of those ones. Right. This one here, the wolf, is representing, we check here, is representing, I will just put the label here. Right. It's representing the USSR with its ideas. Communist ideas. It's labeled communist infiltration and dictatorship. So it implies that the advancement of communism here it implies that the wolf is advancing, and this wolf here is representing the USSR. So actually, the wolf is representing the USSR and its advancement with communist ideologies, which were going to bring in dictatorship rule and fascism. So the ideas here, it was going to infiltrate and bring in dictatorial rule wherever it was going. So the symbolic representation here is that the wolf is representing the coming of the communist ideology with the advancement of the USSR, and also bringing with it its communist ideology and fascist rule of dictatorship. Then the US aid, this hammer here, which is labeled US aid, the hammer here. We understand the hammer is being used to reinforce. We see those pillars there. The pillar return Greece, and the pillar again return Turkey, and they are along a fence. So this hammer, as we are seeing there, this guy is hammering on top of this pillar here to reinforce the strength of this pillar here. So this pillar here, they written the US aid, is representing the Truman doctrine, or the Truman ideology, or rather we can say the Truman aid. Right, we understand that the USA wanted to reinforce the Truman doctrine on Turkey and Greece because they were vulnerable to attack by the advancement of the coming of the USSR and its ideology. So in this context, we are saying the Truman doctrine was reinforcing aid on Greece and Turkey through the Truman doctrine to resist against invasion by communist rule, which was coming in the form of the wolf, which is portraying the USSR and its communist ideology. Right, moving on to the next question. Right, our next question, comment on why you would consider the caption, what we are driving at, appropriate. What we are driving at. How is it inappropriate? Right, it is appropriate in the context that if we check here, why is it inappropriate? What we are driving at. It implies that this wolf is driving at. Right. It implies this statement here. It's a relative caption. It's a an appropriate caption because the USSR targeted weaker states to influence them. So we're saying the USSR was targeting weaker states, weaker European states. It was targeting them, those smaller states which were weaker, which were weakened by the Second World War. It was targeting to spread its ideology on them, trying to impose its ideology on them. So what we are driving at, they are driving towards Turkey and Greece, if you can see in that instance, and they are targeting to spread their ideology in those states. And also, if you check across the fence, it's written non-communist small nations. All those other non-communist small nations, they were also the target. They were driving at their target. They were driving to attain their target of spreading their ideology in those non-communist small nations. Right. So it's a relevant caption in that sense. Right. Then moving on to the next question. He's saying, refer to source 1A and 1B. Explain how the information in source 1A supports evidence in source 1B regarding the increasing threat of communism. Right, we're just comparing those two sources, 1A and 1B, just finding ideas which are portrayed in source 1A and also trying to figure out how the very same ideas are presented in the other source. Right, we are focusing on the influence regarding the increase of threat of communism, the threat of communism. Right, if we check in our first source, we are told in our first source here, it is talking about, if we check on the first part, it says, talks about the Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its communist international ideology intend to do in the immediate future with their expansive. It's talking about their expansive and proselytizing or persuasive tendencies. Right. Source 1A is telling us that Russia was adopting an expansive and a persuasive tendency across Europe. How is it portrayed here? The same is portrayed by Russia being shown or being portrayed as a wolf, which is expanding or going across Europe, driving across Europe at some target. So these two ideas, they are relating. It's talking about expansive tendencies and persuasive tendencies, and also Russia is being shown here or portrayed as a wolf, which is advancing or driving at some direction, try to influence the non-communist nations. And if we also check, we are told of the Iron Curtain here, where it says an Iron Curtain has descended. An Iron Curtain, we said, is a boundary which is now splitting Europe into two, the capitalist side and the communist side. The same idea is portrayed here by this fence here. The Iron Curtain, which is the boundary, is portrayed by the fence, which is now separating this side where Russia is coming from and this side where we have non-communist small nations. And with Greece and Turkey on the border, who were reinforced by the Truman aid through the Truman Doctrine. So it's another idea whereby we are seeing the Iron Curtain idea being portrayed in source 1A, and is also portrayed by a fence in the next next source, which is source 1B. So those two ideas, they are relating. Right, then you can only highlight on those two ideas. There are other ideas that we can also try to figure out from that particular from those two particular sources, and try to relate how they are portrayed similarly in the two different sources. And we move on to the next question. We are studying source 1C. What, according to the source, was the first concern of the Marshall Plan policymakers? This is an extraction question. It's a level 1 question. We just want to go to the source and get the answer. We are relating to source 1C. The source is saying, what, according to the source, was the first concern? Right, if we check here, it says, first of all, broken economies might foster the growth of communism, much like mulch or compost fosters mushrooms. That's the threat, the first threat, that broken economies might foster the growth of communism. Remember, after the Second World War, the economies of Europe were weak. They were weakened by the Second World War. They were not fully functional. So Russia was taking advantage of those weak economies to impose its ideology on them. They could not resist because they were facing economic challenges. They were in dire straits. They were facing very serious and acute economic challenges. And them being weak because of the ravages that were brought in by the Second World War, Russia took a chance to spread its ideology in those. So it was a threat. It was a concern for the Marshall Plan policymakers that the economies were broken, and that might foster the growth of communism. In the same way, mulch fosters the growth of mushrooms. Right, that is the first response. Moving on, we are saying, the next question is saying, why, according to the source, was condemning the Soviet Union the major second goal of American policy? Give two responses. Why was it a major second goal? Right. We just extract. Second major goal of American policy was to condemn the Soviet Union, which was perceived as having embarked on an active expansion and being irremediable or severely hostile to the USA. So the two reasons here, we are saying it was perceived or seen as having embarked on an active expansion. That is reason number one. It needed to be condemned because it was perceived as having embarked on an active expansion. And It was also seen as being irremediable or severely hostile to the USA. Those are the two reasons. So the first reason is it was perceived as seen as having embarked on an active expansion. And the second reason as being irremediable or severely hostile to the United States. Right, I'll move on to the next question. Right, the next question is saying, quote two pieces of evidence from the source that suggests the aims of the third goal of the policy of containment. The third goal of the policy of containment is saying quote, which means we are just using the source. Right. It talks about Turkey and Greece would guard the Eastern Mediterranean because of their position. Right. The need to contain the Soviet Union plus the desire to rebuild the European economy came together in the third goal. So it was one, they need to contain the Soviet Union and the desire to rebuild the European economy. Those were the two. So it was initially the need to contain the Soviet Union and also the desire to rebuild the European economy. Right, it's an extraction question, which is a level 1 question. Explain the implication of the phrase, the drive for European integration in the context of the policy of containment. Right, where do we get that statement? This statement, we find it here. It says, they need to contain the Soviet Union plus the desire to rebuild the European economy came together in the third goal, which was the drive for European integration. So the implication here is the third goal, the purpose of the third goal was to give a drive for European integration. But it was going to be given through the means of containing the Soviet Union and also through the desire to rebuild the economy of Europe. So the implication here of this statement, if you are to check on it, which was the drive for European integration, which was the drive for European integration. Right. We can safely say in this instance, this is number 144. Right. We can safely say in this context of this statement for number 144, the implication of this statement is the Marshall Plan wanted to create a united Europe. Or we can say the target, they wanted to stop USSR invasion. On weaker non-communists. Right. And also we can argue that they wanted a complete capitalist rule across Europe. Right. So the statement which says the drive for European integration, the implication of the phrase, what does it imply? The drive for European integration. It might mean that the Marshall Plan, in this instance, wanted to create a united Europe. They wanted to unite because by integration, we are saying they were seeing Europe as divided. It was supposed to be integrated. It was supposed to be brought together and brought to one sense and brought to one working arrangement. So they wanted to unite Europe, or we can say they wanted to stop the invasion on USSR, because this invasion here is the one that was causing a disintegration of Europe. Russia is spreading its ideology across Eastern Europe and also invading Central Europe, which was creating the Iron Curtain in this instance, which means Europe was being divided because of the invasions by USSR. So they wanted to stop the invasion by Russia so that Europe will be integrated or be brought to one common understanding. And also, you can say they wanted to complete a complete capitalist rule across Europe. In this context, we are looking at the USA. They wanted to dominate the whole of Europe, and they wanted to have it under the control of capitalist rule. That might be the other implication of the statement. Right, moving on to the next question. That was number 144. We move on to source 1D. Why, according to the source, was the Molotov plan created by the Soviet Union in 1947? Right, this is an extraction question. We just need to use the source. We go to the source and try to get the Molotov plan. It says Molotov plan was a system created by the Soviet Union in 1947 to provide aid to rebuild the countries in East Europe that were politically and economically aligned with the Soviet Union. That was the purpose of the Molotov plan. It had the same intention as the Marshall Plan, but however, the Molotov Plan was selective. They did not want to assist countries which were not inclined to the ideology of communism. It was a truly communist package for only those states that were pro-communist. So the Molotov Plan was initiated to provide aid to rebuild the countries in East Europe that were politically and economically aligned with the Soviet Union. Moving on to the next question, that is number 1.5.2. Quote 2 reasons from the source why the Soviet Union refused to accept financial aid from the Marshall Plan. Right. We want to quote 2 reasons why Russia refused to accept the aid. Right. It goes on to say, it can be seen as the USSR's version of the Marshall Plan, for which for political reasons, the Eastern Europe countries would not be able to join without leaving the Soviet sphere of influence. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov rejected the Marshall Plan of 1947, proposing the Molotov Plan. The Soviet-sponsored economic grouping, which was eventually expanded to become the COMECON. The Molotov Plan was symbolic of the Soviet Union's refusal to accept aid from the Marshall Plan or allow any of their satellite states to do so, because of their belief that the Marshall Plan, the plan was an attempt to weaken Soviet interests in their satellite states. And it also say, by making beneficiary or receiving countries economically dependent on the US. So their reason was, there are 2 reasons, if we are to quote today, why they refused. They said the Marshall Plan was an attempt to weaken Soviet interests. They said their acceptance of the plan, it meant that they were going to be weak in their influence, in their spheres of influence or spheres of interest in their satellite states. So they did not accept it because it was going to weaken the interest in their satellite states. And also, it was making beneficiary countries become economically dependent on the US. By being economically dependent, it also meant that the US was going to impose its ideology on those countries because already they were falling prey to the assistance by the USA. So those were their arguments against the Marshall Plan. That is why they could not accept the Marshall Plan for those 2 reasons. Right. Explain the term satellite states. Satellite states in the context of the Cold War. Explain satellite states. That is number 153. Right, we are going to explain this generally, and then we relate to the context. 153. Right, when we're talking of a satellite states, we are looking at countries that are dominated, or we can say they are influenced by a major state. Which is in this instance a more powerful. This is in general context. When I look at a satellite state, we are looking at a state that is dominated or that is influenced by a major state which is powerful. So whatever the state does is determined by the decision of a powerful state in domination. In this instance, we are saying the USSR in the context was dominating weaker states in East and Central Europe. Those states were the satellite states. So we are referring to the weaker states onto which the communist ideology was imposed on them by the USSR through its expansive tendencies. So the USSR was dominating those weaker states in East Europe and also invading Central Europe. Those were the satellite states. The governments of those states were imposed by Russian ideology. The leaders were imposed by Russian ideology because they were pro-communist. They would listen to communist ideologies. So whatever those governments were doing, they were doing it in support of communism because they were satellite states of the major state of the USSR. That's the idea of satellite states, whichever way you define it, but that's the context of the satellite states. Then moving on to the next question, we have number 154. That's the next question. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, comment on what the COMECON offered the USSR and its satellite states. The COMECON, we are told about the COMECON, what it offered. Right, it says the plan was a system of bilateral trade agreements that established the COMECON to create an economic alliance of socialist countries. This aid allowed countries to stop relying on European aid and therefore allowed Molotov states to reorganize their trade to the USSR. So basically it was based on trade and an economic alliance of socialist states. It offered for the provision and the creation of an economic alliance of socialist states, which meant that they created arrangements, trade arrangements. They were now in some form of trading blocks as countries of the socialist world because of the COMECON. And also this allowed countries in Europe to stop relying on American aid and therefore allowed for Molotov states to reorganize their trade to the USSR instead. Those were the provisions of the COMECON. But if you are to analyze this here, if you are to analyze this, we will actually see that the COMECON or the Molotov plan, ultimately, it did not produce positive results. It did not produce a notable positive results because of its underfunding. The USSR did not have enough funding to support the communist states, but however, it denied them the access to the Marshall Plan, which revived much of the rest of the Western European states. So those were the ideas of the COMECON. Right. Moving on to the next question, that is the paragraph question. The last question is the paragraph question. I will just highlight on how you're supposed to highlight and answer the question. Remember, our paragraph question, we must always answer it in the PIL format, and we must have a clear point, and then we must explain the point, and then we must give some evidence or some examples, then we must link. So I will use my typical example of how I would answer this question here. You can answer it in your own way, but however, we must have the PIL format being portrayed in that particular paragraph. The question is saying, using the information in the source and the relevant sources, Right. Write a paragraph about 8 lines, which is 80 words, explaining how the policy of containment contributed to Cold War tensions. We are looking at how the policy of containment contributed to Cold War tensions. So we must have an independent response. We must have an independent answer to the question about how the policy of containment contributed to Cold War tensions. Right. So in this instance, I will say the policy of containment, apparently, it blocked USSR from creating spheres of influence across Europe, or from expanding across Europe. That can be my independent answer. How? In the sense that the containment policy by USA, it blocked the attempt or the expansive tendencies of Russia to spread this ideology of communism across Europe. That was the source of tension. Someone is trying to advance their ideas and you are blocking them through your policy. So it widened the rift between the USSR and the USA. Then you explain. You are explaining the idea. You can explain that the USSR wanted to spread communism across Europe by targeting weaker European states. But however, the USSR, the USA, through its containment policy, wanted to stop the spread of communism. Then you go on to highlight evidences of the expansion by USSR in spreading its ideas. Like if you can quote source 1A, it talks about expansive tendencies. The USSR and its communist bloc, they adopt an expansive tendency. It's evidence to support that USSR wanted to spread these ideas. Then you also quote some other evidence about the USA trying to stop the spread. Talk about the Iron Curtain. Europe was divided into two, the capitalist side and the communist side. You can go to the source of the cartoon, where there is the hammer of the US aid. It's evidence. Through the Truman Doctrine, the USA supported Greece and Turkey to resist against Russia invasion. It's evidence that you get from that source. So you can figure out your evidence from different sources. Then you link your paragraph to show that whatever you were discussing here is supporting the fact that US attempt to block USSR from creating spheres of influence. Through those means, it widened the tension between the two extreme ends. That is basically how you must answer your paragraph question in PL format. Right, that takes us to the end of the question. We are going to move on to question number 2, and we are going to highlight the possible responses for question number 2. As usual, our question number 2 is Independent Africa, which is the focus on Angola. Our focus of the question is saying, why did the United States of America become involved in the Angolan Civil War from 1975? That is our focus. Right, so moving on to the question. Which country, according to the source, did not want the MPLA to gain control of Luanda, the capital city of Angola? That is an extraction question. We can get it here. The United States of America did not want the MPLA to gain control of Angola. So it's a clear extraction question. The answer is the USA for the first question. It's clear. Name 3 provisions in the source for the Central Intelligence Agent's involvement in Africa. The 3 provisions, we are supposed to extract them again from the source. The 3 provisions, you find them here. it talks about gaining control under the direction of the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, of the CIA. Operations gained through underground in 1975. Provisions for the U.S. involvement in Africa were intentionally vague and stated that the CIA's involvement in Africa was to be a provision of material, support, and advice to create a stable climate in the new independent African countries. So the three provisions: provision of material, 1, of support, 2, and advice. Those were the three provisions mentioned. Then moving on to the next question. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why you think it was necessary for the CIA to covertly support UNITA and FINLA in 1975. This word here, covertly, is a key word in our question. Right. What does that imply if you are saying America was assisting FNLA and UNITA covertly? Covertly. Right. I will just briefly explain so that you figure out sense from that particular context of the question. Our question is question number 1.3. So I'll just try to highlight 213 here. Right. We are saying the USA was offering aid covertly. Covertly, in other words, it means secretly. They did not want to disclose that they were involved in Angola. They were hiding their aid to the movements in Angola. They were hiding. Why were they hiding that provision? Why did they not provide help openly? Right. In this instance here, the first and most definite response is the American government feared widespread condemnation from its own people. Why would it face condemnation from its own people? Remember, America was involved in Vietnam War. In the most recent previous era, America was involved in Vietnam, and it lost that war. And that war, it costed the American economy, and also it costed lives. So many soldiers were lost in that particular war. So it meant that the people of America would not accept such a decision for the USA to keep on getting involved in foreign politics, which were not beneficial for them. They would condemn the government. And also, for one reason, we would say the government would be threatened by widespread protests. Remember, people ended up protesting back in America because of the America's involvement in Vietnam. They wanted the government to withdraw. Then it meant that they would not accept such another event where the government gets involved again in another foreign political dilemma and involving the loss of lives of its own people and also its resources. It led to a very serious economic problems for the economy of America because of expansive spending in the war in Vietnam. So they had to hide their aid to Angola. And also we can say it was also a fact that the government feared to become unpopular, or it was going to lose support from its own people. People were no longer going to support that government's decision. They would lose support. If there was going to be an election, it means that they were going to lose the election because people were no longer in support of their decisions of getting involved in foreign politics and spending a lot of money and also losing a lot of lives for getting involved in foreign politics. So the Americans had to hide their involvement in Angola for some of those reasons. Right, moving on to the next question. That was number 213. We need to move to 214. explain the limitations of this source to a researcher studying the role of the MPLA in Angola. Right. When we're talking of the limitation, we are saying the source does not give us a clear picture of the involvement of MPLA. It does not provide us with a clear picture. It has some missing facts. Right. So what can we say with regard to limitation of this particular source here? Right. If we check this source, it says the source is an extract from the book Kisinga in Angola, Influence of Personality of Foreign Policy working paper by M. Guter. It highlights how the United States of U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger influenced American foreign policy towards Angola. Right. So if we check, when we're looking at the limitation of this source, we are looking at question number 214. Right. This source is limited in the sense that it's biased. It's biased, it has bias. It's one-sided. It only focuses on the USA's perspective. So it's limited because it has bias. It does not give a balanced view of the involvement in Angola by other countries. It only focuses on USA's involvement and its support for UNITA and FNLA. So it's biased in that sense. Then also, we can say this source is limited because it ignores the fact that the MPLA was the most powerful movement of the three. If you check, a source can be limited because it ignores historical facts that are known. We all know that in the history of Angola, the MPLA was the strongest movement of the three. But this source ignores that fact. It does not mention anything about the MPLA. It only focuses on the CIA giving aid to UNITA and FNLA. And also, some other non-facts. It ignores, this source here does not mention anything. It is ignoring the support by USSR and Cuba to MPLA. Those are also non-facts. Despite the USA focusing on its support on UNITA and FNLA, but however, it is also ignoring some definite facts that despite them not wanting the MPLA to control Angola, but the MPLA was also strong and was powerful, and also the fact that some other European countries, like the USSR, and also Cuba from Asia, it was also supporting the MPLA. Those are non-facts which are ignored in the source. So the source is limited to someone who wants to study about the MPLA because that source is limiting information on the side of MPLA. Right. So that takes us to the end of source 2A. Let's move to source 2B. Source 2B is there. We move to the questions. Source 2B, question 2.21. Quote evidence from the source that suggests Mobutu was supported with millions of dollars. We are referring to Mobutu of Zaire here, Mobutu Seseko. Right. If we check on our source, it says the US had poured uncounted millions of dollars into the bottomless pit of Mobutu's corrupt military dictatorship over the previous 10 years. So that is a quotation which suggests that Mobutu was supported with millions of dollars. The US had poured uncounted millions of dollars into the bottomless pit of Mobutu's corrupt military dictatorship over the previous 10 years. That's the quote. Moving on to the next question, number 2.22. Right, the question is saying, what, according to the source, did Mobutu do when the world copper prices plunged in early 1975? Give two responses. Again, it's an extraction question. It says, he expelled the US ambassador, one. And it also says, he accused the US of backing a coup to topple him. Those were the two measures. First, he accused the US of backing a coup to topple him. And two, he expelled the US ambassador. Right. Moving on to the next question. 2.23. Why, according to the source, was only 41.7 million US dollars and not 100 million authorized by the National Security Council to ensure that Walden Roberto won the Angolan civil war? This is an extraction question. It's a level 1. We are supposed to take the answer from the source. Let's go to the source. Right. It says, CIA Director William Colby told the National Security Council he needed $100 million to ensure that Walden Roberto, the leader of FNLA, won. But this was too large a sum to keep secret. Only 41.7 million US dollars was authorized. Why? Because that was too large a sum to keep secret. That's the reason. The amount was too large to keep secret. It meant that it was going to pose a negative bearing on the US economy. It was going to produce a notable result, which was going to be questionable by the people. So they could not ultimately disburse such a large sum of money for the reason that it was too large to keep it secret. Moving on to the next question. It says, comment on what is implied by the statement. CIA's task seemingly was not to win, but to prevent an easy victory for the Soviet-backed forces. What is the implication of that statement? That the CIA's task seemingly was not to win, but to prevent an easy. Right. So trying to answer this question here, we can say the CIA, they knew that, the CIA in this instance knew that they could not win. In this instance, we are saying UNITA and FNLA, which they supported. They knew that they would not win in that war, but rather wanted to pose a challenge to MPLA. They wanted to prove that UNITA and FNLA could provide a constraint to the winning of MPLA, though they knew that at the end they were not going to win it. It was necessary that in future, if there was need for negotiations between those movements, they were going to consider them because they knew well that they had given them a very serious challenge for them to get into power. If it was an easy goal for MPLA, it meant that in future they were going to ignore those movements because they would be definitely knowing that they are powerless and they cannot do anything. So the CIA was supporting those two movements as a way of showing some form of challenge to the MPLA, such that they would recognize their presence as part of the revolutionary movement of Angola. Right. That might be one of the responses, but not all. You can also highlight some of the necessary, some of the relevant responses to that. Right. Then the last question, self-determination. When we are talking of a self-determination, we are saying it's a state where the people have a right to shape or their destiny. Their destiny, we are saying their future. People have got a right to determine their future. Their future in terms of politics, Their political future is in their hands. In a self-determination, we allow people to choose their leaders. Their social life, their economic life is in the hands of the people in a self-determination. So people, when they have a right to shape their destiny or their future, that is a self-determination. Right, moving on to the next source. Quote and two pieces of evidence mentioned in the source that explains why Wuslander was opposed to covert operation programs in Angola. It's a court question. We're supposed to pick from the source. Why was he opposing covert involvement in Angola? He wanted an open involvement in the Angolan politics. Right, if you are to check that source, it says why he was opposing it. It says, simply put, I was opposed to the covert action program in Angola because I was convinced, he was convinced that it would not succeed. And also, it would badly damage our ability to work in the future with moderate elements throughout Africa. Those were the two responses to that question. Why Wuslander was opposed? He opposed in the sense that he was convinced that it would not succeed. Operating in secret, he felt it would not succeed. And also, it would badly damage their ability to work in future with other moderate elements throughout Africa. If they would fail, it means no other country would accept being assisted by Europe, by the USA in their move to try and gain independence in their states. Right. Then the next question is question number 2.3.2. Explain the term covert action. I think we've previously talked about covert. Right. We are looking in the context of CIA involvement. So we just have to highlight the term of covert action here. We said when we're talking of covert, so we are saying this is question number 2.3.2, covert action. Right, covert, we said this is secret. So we are saying in the context of the CIA, we are saying the CIA providing secret aid and being involved in secretive operations in Angola. So covert action, we are saying it was the CIA in this instance, which was providing secret aid and also being involved in secretive operations in Angola. They did not want people to know that the USA was actively involved in the Angolan politics. So whatever they were providing to Angola, was it financial aid or was it military aid, they would smuggle it through the DRC to hide it from people knowing that American planes were actually bringing in some military equipments in Angola. They would drop them from Angola and then would ship them into Congo secretly, smuggle them into Congo secretly, so that people would not know. And the Americans apparently would also not know that the Americans are providing aid to Angola, and also they are involved actively in operations to try and assist UNITA and FNLA in their battle against the MPLA in Angola. Right, moving on to the next question is question number 2.3.4, 2.3.3. Comment on what is implied by the statement. Kissinger feared that an MPLA victory would have destabilizing or disrupting effects throughout Southern Africa in the context of USA's involvement. Kissinger feared that an MPLA victory would have destabilizing effects. Right. What it meant here is number 233. 233. If MPL was going to succeed, it was going to destabilize the region. Why? Because USSR would influence Angola and the Southern African region. Which meant that they were going to bring in chaos through their governments. Dictatorship rule. It meant that if MPL was going to take over Angola, the implication was Angola was going to be under the influence of Russia. And once Russia was in the region, it was going to spread its ideas across. Remember the domino theory, which was applied to Asia. It was also going to apply to African states. If one African state falls to communism, then the whole region will also be part of the communist world. And hence, those countries will be destabilized. Democracy will be a thing of the past. They will impose their dictatorial rule and impose the pro-communist governments in the region. That was going to destabilize the government. And also in general, we could say communism would threaten democracy in the region. People would be exposed to fascist rule if Angola was to dominate, to be dominated by the USSR through MPLA. So that was going to also threaten the democracy in the region. Right. And any other suggestion that you can come out with? Right, number 234, the next question. What, according to the source, did Uslander do during his all-night session with Senator Clark at Killoran's Luanda residence? Give 2 responses. This is an extraction question. What did he do? I did my best to argue the US police position and defend the covert action program during my all-night session with Senator Clark at Killoran Luanda residence. Right, so our response is he had to argue, he did his best to argue the US police position, 1, and he had to defend the covert action program. Those are the 2 responses for that particular question. It's a level 1 question where we're supposed to give 2 responses. Right, moving on to the last source, just 2D. It says, comment on why you would not agree with Kissinga's statement. In my country is part involved in this mediation of the conflict. Promise to do everything to bring it to a definitive end. Let's go to the source and see the context of this. Kisinga, we are seeing MPLA on one end, and we are also seeing UNITA on the other end. And what is the implication here? Kisinga is in between as a mediator, and he's saying, and my country, as a party involved in the mediation of the conflict, promises to do everything to bring it to a definitive end. We are saying we cannot agree. We would not agree with Kisinga's statement. Why we would not agree with this statement here? Right, we might not agree to that statement for a reason that the USA, if we can check here, we cannot agree with what he's saying because it's definite that the USA wanted UNITA victory. So they would not mediate to the extent of fairness. They will be biased towards UNITA in their mediation. So what he's saying, we cannot agree with it. That he will bring to a definitive end. Never, because he is on the side of UNITA in this instance. And also, what can we also argue? The USA, even though they're mediating, they would continue funding UNITA. As we can also see there, is pushing aid towards UNITA while he's trying to mediate. So in this instance, we are saying we cannot agree with him. He is giving UNITA support and nothing to MPLA, which means that they would continue funding UNITA, and UNITA will keep on fighting MPLA. And that will never bring a definitive end. That will never bring an end to the conflict, though they are trying to appear as if they are mediating between the two. So you can highlight some other reasons as to why we would not agree with that particular statement. Or besides talking about funding, we can also see the Americans providing, USA providing weapons to UNITA. So we cannot agree that they will bring a definitive end, while they are providing weapons to one side. It meant that they could not be able to provide a definitive end to the to provide a resolutive means to this conflict here. The conflict would continue because they are still issuing out assistance of through military and weapons and through funding to UNITA, which will further on aggravate the extent of fighting in Angola. Right. And any other response that you might come out with? Moving on to the next question, what conclusion can be drawn from the cartoonist portrayal of the following liberation movements regarding their relations with the USA? The MPLA, let's look at the portrayal of the MPLA, their relationship with the USA. If we check this guy, he's sweating. And if we can see his appearance there. Right. What kind of relationship here? This is typical of a rival relationship. Rivalry. There is enmity between these two. Or we can describe the relationship as an opposing relation. One is against the other. Or we can say this is a divergent relation. There is lack of trust there between these two. They are rivals, they are enemies. This one is communist, this one is capitalist. And then this trying to mediate. There's lack of trust in this relationship. Then if you check UNITA, you see this guy is appearing to be very happy. He's even smiling. So the relationship on this side, we can say these ones are close associates. In this instance, they're working together, they are allies. They're working together. They are affiliates. They have got an affiliate relationship, working together for one common goal. Or we can say they are having a coalition. They are united in their fight against UNITA. So they have good relations. That is why he's smiling here. He's receiving some goodies. He's receiving some weapons to fight against this one who is not receiving anything. And also, if you can check here, this guy is showing that he's even scared. And also, we can see that the relationship here is that of untrustworthy. There is lack of trust with this guy through Kissinger here, which is representing the USA. Right. Let's look at the next question. Refer to source 2A and 2D. Comment on how the information in source 2A supports evidence in source 2D regarding the involvement of USA in Angola. Right. Let's look at the two sources and try to figure out the evidence. If we check source 2A, we want to figure an idea here, right? Source 2A is talking about, we want to compare source 2A to 2D. Right, if you look at source 2A saying, talk about that, source 2A is here, sorry. Let me just erase off some of the markings here so that we can figure out a sense. Source 2A, if we are to figure out here, what is it saying? It is saying the United States of America did not want the Movement Popular Liberation of Angola, MPLA, to gain control of Angola. And under the direction of the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, CIA, operations in Angola gained serious ground in 1975. Right. The United States of America did not want the USA to gain control. Did not want the MPL to gain control. How is this idea portrayed here? The idea is portrayed, if you can check here, by this facial expression. It shows that the MPLA is being neglected in this mediation by Kissinger. Kissinger is biased towards UNITA. If you can see, he's pushing aid on this side here, which means he did not want this side to succeed. That is why he's supporting this side. So this idea is portrayed again. The fact that Americans did not want the MPLA to control Angola is portrayed by how Kissinger is pushing aid towards UNITA while he's ignoring the MPLA on his other side. Is one idea that you can put that is portrayed in those two sources. Then another idea, you can also go back to the source A. It says here, the USA wanted to create a stable climate in newly independent African countries. It wanted to create a stable climate. How is that supported? It's supported by the fact that Kissinger is saying his country is part of the mediation of the conflict. The fact that Kissinger is saying America is part of the mediation process, it also suggests that the USA wanted to create a peaceful state, create a peaceful and stable climate in independent African states. Its support. And also it talks about here, if you go to source A, it talks about the USA providing covert aid. It talks about $22 million in covert support. Over 22 million covert support to FNLA and UNITA. How is that portrayed? That is also shown by this box here, which is being shielded to UNITA in this instance. So the effect of aid there, about 22 million aid in US dollars, and this box here with some weapons and some goodies, it represents the aid being given to UNITA. So it's supporting each other. So those are some of the elements that you can highlight. You just highlight an idea which is portrayed in one source and also try to figure out how the same idea is presented in the other source. Right, coming to the last question of our question 2.6. Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph or 8 lines explaining, our question is here, explaining why the USA became involved in Angolan civil war from 1975. So our paragraph must have a point, explanation, must have evidence, and must have a linking statement. The question is saying why the US was involved. That is our focus of the question. So your point must address the question of why the USA was involved in Angola. USA was involved for some reasons, which we can highlight. Either it was for containment purposes. USA got involved in Angola because of the policy of containment. They did not want Russia to spread its ideology in Angola. So they were blocking USSR's influence. Or you can say the USA also wanted to spread capitalism in independent Africa. That might be their reason. And also you can say the USA was targeting Angolan resources. Which was mainly oil, and also you can talk of mineral resources. Those are some of the reasons that you can highlight on the US. Then you explain, you are giving further details. Why was America blocking through containment theory, the USA? They were fearing that the USA would destabilize the region. So they wanted to stop the spread of communism. And also they wanted to further their interests of capitalism. At the same time, they wanted to benefit from the resources of Congo. Then you give evidence from the given sources. That is where you now highlight those pieces of evidences that you can figure out from any of those sources, any relevant sources. America provided covert aid to UNITA. It's some form of evidence. America wanted to claimed that if they would allow the USSR to influence Angola, it was going to destabilize the region as evidence. You highlight all those forms of evidence and then you link back to your line of argument. You would have done justice to your paragraph question in PIL format. Right, that takes us to the end of question number 2. We need to move on to question number 3, which is our question on the focus of the question is how did the non-violent approach adopted by Martin Luther King Jr. characterize the civil society protests in the USA during the 1960s? Right, we go to our first question. Our first question is talking about who, according to the source, indirectly influenced King Jr. to apply the non-violent approach to specific problems of African Americans. This is an extraction question. Right. We are told of Martin Luther King Jr. being influenced by the actions of Gandhi. So we are looking at Mahatma Gandhi here being a character who influenced the ideas of non-violent protests against the British in India. So in this instance, we are saying those ideas were based on the core ideas of Mahatma Gandhi, India. What, according to the source, did King Jr. learn from a sermon by President of Howard University, Mordecai Johnson, regarding nonviolent approach? What did he learn? Right. So this we are going to extract from the source. Right. It says, for King, the heart of Gandhi's nonviolent was love in the spiritual, transcendent, or divine form of the word. In the face of coercive intimidation or racist British rule, Gandhi so loved his oppressors that he refused to take up arms against them. That was what Martin Luther learned, that he must love his oppressors and that he refused to take up arms against them. We are saying you must not fight against your oppressors, you must love them if you are to adopt a non-violent approach of protests. Right. The next question, define the term non-violent. Mass protests. Right. This question here requires us to define non-violent as an aspect of the question. Non-violent, we are saying this is peaceful demonstration. And the term mass, it implies that it is being done by large numbers. So combining the two to make a statement, we are saying this is a peaceful protest or a peaceful demonstration by a large group of people. If you are to define non-term mass protest, because the term mass must also be addressed. So it's a peaceful demonstration by a large group of people if you are defining it in simple context. Explain what King Jr. implied by the statement. It, non-violence, means putting oneself in the face of violence in the context of civil society protests. That is number 314. What's the implication of that statement? It meant putting oneself in the face of violence. Right. This is 314. It meant that they sacrificed to expose themselves to police brutality or to harm, because the police would respond in a harsh way that would harm the protesters, even though they were non-violent. Or the statement would also imply that the police would respond harshly to the protesters. despite them adopting a non-violent approach, but also the police would respond. So that is the implication of it meant putting oneself in the face of violence. The police would use violence to the protesters, or it meant that they would sacrifice themselves to harm while engaging in non-violent protests. Right, moving on to the next question. What, according to the source, did King Jr. want to achieve by organizing thousands across the South in specific mass action? This again is extraction. We just want to go to the source. It also meant organizing thousands across the South in specific mass actions that would force face-to-face encounters with white racist power. Doing so, King thought it would demonstrate both the potence or weakness of white violence, and it would show the country that the black community was not afraid or to insist on their rights. Those are the responses, any one of those two. The fact that it would demonstrate the weakness of the white violence, and also would show the country that the black community was not afraid to insist on its rights. Right, moving on to the next source. According to the source, why did King Jr. believe that at the point of making a choice among its militant or massive non-violent or riot had arrived? Give two responses. Why there were so many responses there? According to this source, he says it must be militant, massive non-violence or riots, because the discontent is so deep, the anger is so ingrained, the despair, the restlessness is so wide. Those are the reasons as to why he's advocating for such. Right. What did King Jr. imply by the words? But I'm convinced that if rioting continues, it will strengthen the right wing of the country. If rioting continues, it would strengthen the right wing. By the right wing here, we are referring to the segregationists, those who were pro-segregation, who were advocating for segregation. They would strengthen themselves if the rioting continues. What does he imply by those words? So the implication here is that is 3, 1, that is 3, 2, 2. One of the implication is the right wing would find excuses or would find justifications of using violence against protesters. If they would riot, it also implied that it would be justified for the right wing to use violence on them. So they will strengthen and they will use more violent means because they will be using non-violent means of protesting. So by using non-violent means of protesting, it implied that there was no justification for the right wing to use violence on them. But if they will also resort to rioting or violent means, then it would justify the fact that the right wing must also use violent means and strengthen their side. And also, it will imply that the right wing will dominate through violent attacks on protesters. So they will apparently gain an upper hand. They will dominate because already they have the means to use violence on those protesters, which implies that if they continue rioting, it will also give power to the right wing to be successful in their means to use violence. And also it will imply that more violent means or strategies would be employed against against the protesters. If they riot, it also means that they will employ more violent means, and hence that is going to squash and repress the protests by those guys. Right, moving on to the next question. The next question is saying, this is question number 3.22. The next question is question 3.23. Give N2 reasons in the source suggesting that King Jr. was totally committed to non-violent approach. This is an extraction question. I am committed to non-violent, absolutely. I am just not going to kill anybody. He was not going to kill anybody, whether it's in Vietnam or here. I am not going to burn down any building. It implies that he was resorting to non-violent means by promising not to kill anybody and also promising not to burn any building. Right. We move on to the next question. Explain the term racial justice. Racial justice. Right. We are going to define it simply. We are saying racial justice in this instance, it refers to, in this question, we are saying our racial justice, it refers to a situation when all races are respected, or their rights. The rights of all races are respected. That is racial justice. A situation when the rights of all races are respected. That is a situation of racial justice. Or we can talk of fair treatment of all races. Despite racial differences, all races must be treated fairly. That is racial justice. Right. Question 325, comment on the usefulness of this source for a historian researching on non-violent protests in the USA. The usefulness, right? How useful is this source? When you are checking on usefulness of the source, this is question 3.2.5, usefulness of the source. When you're checking on usefulness, check on something tangible. What does the source tell you? That is useful information. What information of substance did you get to realize from that source regarding nonviolent resistance? Right. The source here, it shows commitment to nonviolent protests. If you check King Jr., is committing himself to non-violent by promising that he will never kill anyone and he will never burn any building. It shows great commitment to non-violent protests. So it's useful in that sense that people dedicated themselves to non-violent protests. And also, we can also say it reflects on the harm of rioting. It shows that the right wing was going to get strength if people would use rioting. So they were supposed to resort to peaceful protests. It also reflects, if you check the source, nonviolent protests as a philosophy. A philosophy, you are saying, it's a way of life. It was a way to be adopted by Black Americans. It was supposed to be their way of life, not to respond violently to their oppressors. It was supposed to be a way of life to respond in a non-violent way, to protest in a non-violent way. So it also gives a reflection on non-violent protest as a philosophy. And also you can say, this is also direct words from Martin Luther King, who was a leader of the civil rights protests. So it's also useful in that sense, that these are direct words which were ushered by a leader of non-violent protests. Right, taking us to source 3C, explain what the following groups wanted to achieve in terms of lunch counter in seats in the USA in the early 1960s. Students sitting at the lunch counter and white group in the background. Let's look at the addendum and look at those two groups. We look at these three guys who are seated, who are having a sit-in, and also we're looking at this group of guys who are standing and who are pouring a liquid substance. Here you can see on this guy. Right. What did they want to achieve? These ones here who are seated, they wanted their concerns to be heard by engaging in a sit-in. It was a way of showing their discontent and wanted their concerns to be heard. That is on these two, the three who are seated, and these ones who are pouring a liquid on the ones who are seated. These ones here, they are what we can relate to in terms of what they wanted to achieve. They wanted to intimidate these guys. They wanted to scare these guys. Or in other dimensions, we can say they wanted to entrench segregation. They wanted segregation to continue by threatening these guys who are having a sit-in. Or we can say they wanted to humiliate them in another dimension. You are seeing they are pouring a liquid there to humiliate this guy. They wanted to humiliate them. That is what we can highlight there. Why do you think students participating in the sit-ins did not hit back against the intimidation by white group? Why did they not hit back? It's because, for one of the reasons is because this is 332. Sit-ins were non-violent. They would not fight back because they were engaging in a non-violent protest. Their idea was a non-violent protest. So basically, they were engaging in non-violent protests. Or in other words, you can say they wanted to weaken the intimidation. If someone intimidates you and you don't fight them back, then at the end of the day, they will all of a sudden, they will become realize that they're not doing good. You do bad to someone expecting that they will fight back, and they don't fight back to you. Then you will become weak in your struggle against that particular person. You are fighting against someone who is not against you. You are fighting against someone who is fighting for their own rights. Then it was going to weaken the intimidation by the whites. Right, the next question is saying, refer to source 3A and 3C. Comment on how the information in source 3A support evidence in source 3C regarding King Jr.'s non-violent approach. Right, we're just going to highlight there how, if we check source A, it's talking about sit-ins as a philosophy. It's saying sit-ins is a philosophy as a way of life. In A, it highlights that it was supposed to be taken as a philosophy. And how is it implied? It's a way of life. It is also shown as a philosophy through the sit-ins, which were non-violent. These guys are sitting in, and they are not causing any violence. So it supports each other. And also, it talks about the coercive rule of the British. If we check where it is describing Mahatma Gandhi, it says, in the face of coercive or intimidating British rule, the British were intimidating or trying to scare the Indians. But we are also seeing the same idea here. These whites are pouring a liquid here to try to intimidate these guys. It's the same idea which is portrayed there. And also it talks about non-violent protests weakening, demonstrating the weakness of white violence. And also here, they are trying to cause some form of violence by pouring a liquid on the guy on a sit-in. But however, their cohesion is going to get weak because he's not responding. So those ideas are correlated. They support each other from the two different sources. Right, moving on to the last source, study source 3D, 351, quote two criticisms from the source that were leveled against King Jr.'s nonviolent approach by Malcolm X. This is an extraction question. We just go to the source and try to quote the evidence. He says here, Malcolm X goes beyond that in some of the things I've heard him say. to say that this is deliberately a philosophy of love of the oppressor, which he identified completely as non-violent movement. He says the philosophy movement are actually encouraged by whites. Right. Why are they encouraging non-violent protests? Because he's leveling the accusation that because it makes them comfortable, makes them believe that the Negroes are submissive and they are passive creatures. Those were the accusations of non-violent protests. It accuses non-violent protests in the sense that it makes the whites comfortable. And also it believes that the Black Americans were submissive, they are meek, and also they are supine, they are passive creatures. Right. Moving on to the next question. Give any two examples of protests in the source that King Jr. believed touched the conscience and established a sense of shame amongst the white community. The two were sit-ins, the sit-in movement, and the Birmingham movement through the freedom rides. So it was the freedom rides and the sit-ins. Those were the two types of protests that weakened the in the question, the protests that are believed touched the conscience and established a sense of shame amongst the white, because they were using the freedom rides, which was non-violent, and also they were using the sit-ins. So those were the two forms of protests. Moving on to the next question. Explain the implication of the following concern raised by James Baldwin. Whether it will be possible to contain the Negro people within the framework of non-violence. The implication of the statement. What does that imply? Right. Whether it would be possible to contain the Negro people, we're referring to the Black Americans, within this framework of non-violence. Right. The implication here is when you're looking at this, he was actually inquesting into whether all Black Americans were going to support non-violent protests. It's an inquest. It's trying to figure out or trying to justify if all blacks were going to support the idea of non-violent protests. Whether if it was possible to contain the Negro people within this framework of non-violence. Was it possible that all the Black people were going to support non-violent protests? Or in other ways, it says non-violent protests, they proved to be a weak challenge by some Black Americans. In another dimension, it means non-violent protests, they were seen as a weak way of challenging segregation by some other Black Americans. Or we can also say some Black Americans supported more radical means against segregation. For example, we can talk of rioting. It's another dimension that we can use there. Right, the last question is a paragraph question. Explaining how non-violent approach adopted by Martin Luther characterized the civil protests. As usual, I'm supposed to answer your question in a pure format, and you are supposed to give an answer to the question. Explain how non-violent approach was a feature of civil protests. How did it become the feature of the civil protests? So in your answer, you can explain that it became a characteristic of civil protests through the enactment of the sit-ins and also through the freedom rides. That is your answer to the question. Through Martin Luther's ideas, Black Americans got to be conscientized to engage in nonviolent protests in the form of the freedom rides and in the form of the sit-ins. Then you explain how they enacted those sit-ins and the freedom rides. And then you go on to give substantial evidence from the given sources to support the sit-ins and also to support nonviolence. The commitment by Martin Luther to engage himself in nonviolent protests. You also show the sit-ins as in another source. You explain and give evidence, then you link back to the line of argument to support that nonviolent protest approach became a feature of civil society protests. Black Americans, through the civil society protests, they adopted a nonviolent approach through the use of sit-ins and through the use of the freedom rides, which were initiated by the ideas of Martin Luther King Jr. That takes us to the end of our section A. Right. We are going to just highlight on how you are supposed to answer the essay questions on section B. Our first question is question number 4, the extension of Cold War, a case study on Vietnam. I understand the content for this essay questions, you'll be having them because you're having it both. The content basically is the same, but what changes here is the context of the question. You are supposed to align your question in the context of the given question. Align your content to answer the question. In as much as you have the content, but the examination requires you to answer the question. You may have the content, but fail to apply the content to the context of the question. So what I'm going to guide you through here is how you were supposed to structure your content, how you were supposed to align your content to the questions. Question number 4, the case study on Vietnam. The military tactics and strategies used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War between 1962 and 1975 proved to be successful and in defeating the strong army of the USA. Do you agree with the statement? This statement? Support your line of argument with relevant historical evidence. Right. Our key aspect here is the tactics by the USA. The tactics used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War proved to be successful in defeating the strong army of the USA. That is our point. The Viet Cong strategies and tactics proved to be successful in defeating the strong army. Do you agree with this? We must agree. Our introduction must have our 3 points. I will just highlight on question 4. Right. Number 1, your line of argument in agreement. Because we know that the result was in favor of the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong was able to defeat the Americans. So you must agree with the statement. Why? We want a reason. Viet Cong strategies were very effective. And ultimately, it led to the victory of the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War. We know the result of the war. Then you elaborate. This essay is going to further explain on the tactics and strategy that were employed by the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War against the Americans. That is your introduction, which is contextualized. You must agree the line of argument because we know the result of the war that was in favor of the Viet Cong. Then you must give reasons why you are agreeing. You support the idea that the guerrilla tactics were effective. And also you highlight that the American strategies were conventional and were not very effective against the guerrilla warfare tactics. Then you elaborate. That is your line of argument. That is your introduction, which is contextualized in this essence of this question here. So if you decide to disagree, you will fail to prove a point because we know well that American strategies were ineffective against the Viet Cong. Then you go to your paragraphs. Make sure that they are in peel format. You highlight the Viet Cong strategies. But remember, this is a war situation. You cannot focus only on the Viet Cong strategies. The Viet Cong strategies, as you highlight on them, for example, the guerrilla tactics, the hit and run, you highlight on them and you show in your linking statement to show that they were successful in defeating the strong army of the USA. Talk of guerrilla warfare tactics, talk of hit and run, talk of the booby traps, talk of support from peasant farmers, talk of support from neighboring countries, talk of the usage of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, talk of support from China and USSR, talk of the Tet Offensive, talk of the usage of the geographical knowledge, talk of not having uniforms. Those are the Viet Cong strategies that you must highlight. And you must link them to the fact that they were effective in defeating the strong army of the USA in your linking statements. Then on the other side, when you're highlighting on the American strategies, remember the American strategies, you are well versed with them. Talk of Operation Rolling Thunder, talk of search and destroy, talk of aspects like villagization, talk of strategies like deployment of young and inexperienced soldiers, talk of the deployment of 500,000 troop members, talk of the My Lai massacre, all those points. Talk of the chemical warfare, the usage of napalm, talk of Operation Rangent, where you look at Agent Orange, you look at Agent Blue, all those tactics by the Americans, you link them in the sense that they were ineffective to defeat the Viet Cong strategies, because we know the results of the war that they were in favor of the Viet Cong. Then you come to your conclusion. When you come to your conclusion, that is where now you are supposed to tie up your argument, and you can reaffirm a key point to support. Referring back to the line of argument, you are tying up your argument in that sense. That takes you to the end of the essay question. And with that being said and done, your essay is contextualized, is answering the question, and with all your paragraphs in context of the question and with a proper linking statement, then that qualifies to be a clear and correct essay, which will give you a very good mark in terms of content coverage and also in terms of presentation. And that will guarantee you a very good mark. That is the question number 4. We're just highlighting on the questions, how we're supposed to answer the questions. Then looking at an independent Africa, the case study for Congo, it says the political, economic, social, and cultural. It is covering all political, it's covering economic, it's covering social and cultural policies introduced by Mobutu after gaining independence in 1960, were a dismal failure. Critically discuss the statement above by using relevant historical evidence to support your line of argument. Right. This is a critical discussion. So when you're answering this one here for question number 5, a critical discussion is answered slightly different from a do you agree? So a critical discussion, we want a dual line of argument, which means you must adopt 2 lines of argument. You must have the main line of argument, and you must have a counter argument. Then, when you're giving reasons, you give in support of the main argument, main reasons, and also you give on the counter reasons. Then you give an elaboration. What are we saying here? We are saying when you are giving the main reason, the question is saying critically discuss that Mobutu failed. So a critical discussion question, you are supposed to either approve the statement or disapprove the statement. In this essence, our direction of the argument is in the negative direction. We know that Mobutu, whatever attempt he tried to introduce under his rule, did not succeed in terms of political uplifting the lives of people, or economically uplifting the lives of people, or socially, he did not succeed. So the fact that it was a dismal failure, we must approve that statement. So the easiest way of approving a statement is to repeat it. So we can say those policies by Mobutu, they proved to be a dismal failure under his rule. It's the main argument. Then the counter argument, however, despite him realizing more failures, there were instances of him succeeding in his policies. Or it is, however, notable that Mobutu, to some extent, he succeeded in some of his policies on a smaller scale. That's the counter argument. Then we go on to the reasons. Why are you saying he failed? You are highlighting generally on his failures. The political terrain of Congo was transformed from being a democracy to becoming a one-party state, which deprived people of their political rights. You are highlighting the failures on the side of the politics. Or the economy of Congo became one of the worst performing economies with very high unemployment and very high levels of poverty. You are highlighting on the economic situation. You just have to give general reasons there. Then when you go to the counter reasoning, you're supposed to also highlight the reason on the counter argument. Why you are saying Mobutu, to some extent, he proved positive results for the people of Congo. It is through Mobutu's dictatorial rule that he managed to silence the Katanga rebellion. It is a positive move. Or the introduction of autocracy in Congo proved to create a political stable environment and managed to silence the infighting or the rivalry amongst the ethnic groups in Congo. It can be highlighted as a positive reason. So that way you find and justify that he succeeded somehow. Then you elaborate what historical evidence are you going to use in the presentation. Then in this essay, you have to balance your argument. You have to provide some positives in the essay. Though your main argument is on the negative, we are saying Mobutu failed dismally. You highlight on economic policies like nationalization, where he took over control of previously private-owned businesses. You look at Zairenization, where he replaced foreigners with Zaire people. You look at policies like kleptocracy, which was a self-enriching policy. You look at nepotism. You look at corruption. All those policies, how they impacted on the economy of Congo. Right. You go on to political. You look at Mobutu coming to power through a coup. You look at Mobutu becoming a dictator. You look at Mobutu seeing democracy as a foreign policy, which was not part of African society. You look at Mobutu creating an elitistic society, elitism. You look at Mobutu under the political terrain, creating a one-party state where all people were supposed to be part of this own political movement. So all those, and you try to link and show how negative was it towards the political development of the independent Congo. Then you go to social, look at education. What happened to education? Look at him withdrawing funding in primary education and how it impacted on the enrollment of primary education. Look at him adopting and taking over the usage of French as a medium of instruction in schools. Look at him letting the public servants going unpaid for days and for months and ultimately for a longer period of time, how it impacted on the health provision and how it impacted on the welfare of the people of Congo. Then you also highlight on some positives of what he did, and you try to link to the counter argument that despite there being much of the negative side, they must also be part of some positives in the discussion. And then you tie back, you link back to your question or to your line of argument, and you conclude your argument. That becomes a full and detailed discussion for that particular question. Then if you go on to the last question, which is question number 6, right? The question number 6 is saying, explain to what extent did the Black Power movement was successful in organizing African Americans to challenge racial discrimination. How successful was it? To what extent was the Black Power movement successful in influencing African Americans to challenge the ideas of discrimination and segregation in the USA during the 1960s? Right. So in that sense there, we can ultimately say it was to a large extent successful. So An extent question, we need to address the extent. I advise you to take this extent here. To a large extent, it was successful. It was successful. Why are you saying it was successful? It was successful because African Americans were able to openly challenge segregation through nonviolent means. You give general reasons as to why. Then you elaborate why, what historical evidence are you going to? This essay is going to prove the effect of the success of the Black Power movement in challenging or in resisting against segregation and resisting against discrimination in the USA in the 1960s. Then you go to your content. Given that your content, you have it. You talk about Malcolm X influencing self-defense against white oppression. You talk of Black pride, the idea of self-respect, and the idea of self-esteem in the Black society. They would be able to challenge segregation through realizing their self-worth as Black people. Black people were also able to, were encouraged to stand up against white domination in pursuit of justice or freedom. Yes, you highlight on those aspects. The use of Americans being elected into public offices, African Americans getting elected, it was a way of challenging. Having them into public offices was a way of challenging and also resisting segregation. Look at the Black Power movement literacy programs, where they were trying to enhance literacy and reduce illiteracy among African Americans, trying to teach the African American child to be self-dependent. It was a way of challenging discrimination against. So those projects, talk of child care projects and medical projects that were initiated to try and enhance the welfare of the Black Americans. Yes, and also try look at the demands by the Black Power movement to have Black history being taught in schools, in Black schools, so that the Black people, the Black Africans were able to realize their history and be able to identify themselves as Blacks. So all those ideas, you use them in the sense that you are supporting the fact that it was to a greater extent successful in the challenge against segregation and against discrimination in America in the 1960s. So with that being said and done, your argument must always be linked to the fact that it was a success towards the challenge against the ideas of segregation and the ideas of discrimination amongst the Black African American society in the USA in the 1960s. Right. With those ideas being brought together, then you need to get to a conclusion where you tie up your argument. You are supposed now to get to a time where you are tying up your argument by referring back to the line of argument. Support the fact of the line of argument that the Black Power movement was successful to a large extent in challenging segregation and discrimination in America. Then you can highlight or reaffirm a key point out of your whole discussion. Then that becomes a detailed and thoroughly covered essay in terms of content coverage and also in terms of your presentation. So with that being said and done, I think that is taking us to the end of our discussion on this particular paper, which is our history paper 1. So the overall impression of the paper is that it's overally a promising paper, which an average learner can ultimately score a very good mark. So with that presentation, we have come to the end of this discussion. We are going to meet again in other discussions to follow. And I encourage you to always keep checking and always keep checking on the discussions to enhance your skills and also to enhance your content in terms of covering the content. Thank you for watching. We'll meet in other discussions to follow.